Hi, and welcome to Finding Your Way Through Therapy, a proud member of the Sightcraft Network. The goal of this podcast is to demystify therapy, what can happen in therapy, and the wide array of conversations you can have in and about therapy. Through personal experiences, guests will talk about therapy, their experiences with it, and how psychology and therapy are present in many places in their lives, with lots of authenticity and a touch of humor. Here is your host, Steve Bisson.
Alors, que faites-vous pour vos fêtes? What are you doing for the holidays? Hi, and welcome to episode 181 of Finding Your Way Through Therapy. If you haven't listened to episode 180, I talk about sobriety and recovery and how that plays a factor during the holidays or at any time. And we talk a little bit about the modalities of how to get treatment and what the difference is. So I hope you go back and listen to that. But episode 181 will be with Daniel Gospodarek. I hope I got it right. He'll correct me if I'm wrong, but he is the owner of Revitalized Mental Health. He works out of Wisconsin and is also licensed in Colorado. He is someone who had a TBI when he was younger and has decided to become a therapist and help people with different types of treatment, including CBT, among other things, as well as EMDR. What I also like is I think that he's going to talk about, hopefully, he's going to talk about cognitive processing therapy, as well as somatic experiencing with Peter Levine. So anyway, here's the interview. GetFree.ai. Yes, you've heard me talk about it previously in other episodes, but I'm going to talk about it again because GetFree.ai is just a great service. Imagine being able to pay attention to your clients all the time instead of writing notes and making sure that the note's going to sound good and how are you going to write that note and things like that. GetFree.ai liberates you from making sure that you're writing what the client is saying, because it is keeping track of what you're saying and will create, after the end of every session, a progress note. But it goes above and beyond that. Not only does it create a progress note, it also gives you suggestions for goals, gives you even a mental status if you've asked questions around that, as well as being able to write a letter for your client to know what you talked about. So that's the great thing. It saves me time, it saves me a lot of aggravation, and it just speeds up the progress note process so well. And for $99 a month, I know that that's nothing. That's worth my time. That's worth my money. You know, the best part of it too is that if you want to go and put in the code Steve50 when you get the service, at the checkout code is Steve50, you get $50 off your first month. And if you get a whole year, you save a whole 10% for the whole year. So again, Steve50 at checkout for getfree.ai will give you $50 off for the first month. And like I said, get a full year, get 10% off. Get freed from writing notes, get freed from always scribbling while you're talking to a client, and just paying attention to your client so they win out, you win out, everybody wins. And I think that this is the greatest thing. And if you're up to a point where you got to change the treatment plan, well, the goals are generated for you. So getfree.ai, code Steve50 to save $50 on your first month. Well, hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 181. You know, one of the catches, sometimes you get guests and you get them through different channels. I have met Daniel okay, I can't pronounce your last name. Daniel.
Gospodarek.
Thank you very much. Through
No
Facebook.
problem.
It was an interesting story, not because of anything else, but you guys know I work with the military. You guys know I work with the first responder world. And I work with trauma in general. I'm an EMDR clinician, and I'm not registered. I'm just very trained. That's about it. But, you know, his story really hit me when I was, you know, he was giving me some tidbits about it. So I welcomed him to the show. So Daniel, welcome to Finding Your Way Through Therapy.
Hey, thank you so much for having me, Steve. I'm happy to be here and just share my experience and knowledge with your listeners.
Well, you know, there's so many things that struck me. So I'm going to have a lot of questions, particularly about ACT, because that's something I like, but people have not explained it properly. But we're not going to jump there first. I just wanted to put that as a teaser. I didn't even explain what ACT is yet. So we'll put it as a teaser for people. But the first thing I want to know is, tell me about yourself. Tell my audience about yourself, what you do, how your life is, so to speak.
Sure. So Currently, I'm a licensed clinical social worker and licensed in Wisconsin as well as in Colorado, and originally from Wisconsin, but lived in Colorado for a period of my life. And but really what kind of the part that led me to this whole, master's in social work, LCSW route was a car accident in July of 2009, and that resulted in a traumatic brain injury for me, and then going through the subsequent recovery process and all those different dynamics, working with a counselor specifically around like anger, and it's a pretty hallmark symptom of a traumatic brain injury. So, so working around that, and then led me to my social work degree and for my bachelor's level, and then a master's eventually. But yeah, that's kind of like a number of years in a process. So kind of let you share if you have questions around some of those components.
The first question I have is, did you serve in the military yourself?
I did not, no. So my traumatic brain injury was when I was 17, and it was severe enough where I wasn't. Yeah,
Well, yeah, it's always
I
interesting.
yeah,
Go
I
ahead.
would I would be I would be more of a liability in some of those situations than an asset. So
Well, I just didn't know your age, so that's why.
yeah,
Like for me, 2009 is not that long ago for a lot of people, but for me, I was already in my 30s by then. So,
yeah. No, I
uh,
was 17. So yeah, I just been released from the hospital and then turned 18. So
okay. Well, no, but that's great to hear that you've surpassed all these issues that come from that. So I really want to hear more about that. I guess one of the
yeah.
standard questions that are probably very related to this, the standard question on finding your way through therapy is, have you ever been in therapy? So my question is, have you ever been in therapy?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it was like structured. I think sometimes when people think of therapy, they think of like psychodynamic therapy where you're laying on a couch, or, EMDR therapy or something like that. It was more just talk therapy, and it was a few years after my car accident, but some of the, like, especially for people not familiar with TBIs, the symptoms can linger and sometimes they never go away, right? In terms of memory challenges, attention challenges, mood challenges, or anger, sleep, insomnia, not sleeping enough, or sleeping too much. And then also just the physical limitations that can come with TBIs. Sometimes there's, sometimes people are paralyzed. Sometimes people don't have use of certain limbs, or sometimes people lose limbs depending on the TBI accident or situation that happened. So for me, the counseling came, I want to say like maybe 3 years afterwards of the TBI, because I tried all those other things, yoga, meditation, working out, just fitness, and trying to manage it, but it wasn't enough. And I needed an outlet, a different sort of outlet.
But I guess one of the questions I had, you mentioned anger, which is a very common theme in the TBI world. Did you do the counseling around that too, or was it
Yeah,
on?
that was specifically why I needed that counseling, was to support just working through some of that anger, because it's a very powerful emotion. It can be a very adaptive emotion, right? Especially for people who are in life-threatening situations, like you need that energy, you need that just almost like brute force that comes with it. But with TBIs, it's different because it's almost just like a hair trigger of
Right.
like somebody clangs a glass, and then you're 0 to 100. You don't need like you don't need that level of anger. And that was like I need some support around this.
I've had limited experience with TBI, so I'll start off with that comment. However, I've dealt with a few people who've had TBIs, and one of the things they explain with their anger is that I used to be able to do blank, whatever we're talking about. Now I
Hmm.
can't, and I feel powerless. And I'm
Hmm.
25, I'm 20, and whatever age they're at. That seems stupid, and they get really down on themselves, and that's why the burst of anger occurs. So that's
Oh,
also what I've seen.
yeah, definitely. And that burst of anger, right? Because of what you could do beforehand, but what you can't do now, right? And then also this piece of like who you were before and who you are now. So meaning like maybe there's physical limitations afterwards, right? But that also means that maybe friends, you can't hang out with certain friends anymore because you lose that social identity aspect. And then there's grief and loss that shows up, right? And
Oh
anger
yeah,
is one of those stages of grief and loss as well. So
absolutely.
I mean, these are very, very intricate dynamics that are happening, or even if your sleep cycle's off and you're more irritable, right? Now and that irritability can quickly morph into anger, right? One of the things with TBIs is like if you get hit in the head, sometimes you're more susceptible to concussions or future TBIs, and then you bump your head and then you get pissed, right?
Right. Right.
So it's a very complex piece to live with. And obviously the caveat there is depends on the severity of the initial TBI, right? Sometimes, a concussion playing football or something may not reach that level of sensitivity thereafter.
Right.
But depending on if it is very severe, right?
Well, I think that I like the fact that they're starting to now see the CTEs, particularly in professional sports, as
Hmm.
part of TBI, and they used to call it Alzheimer's or early onset dementia or whatever.
Right.
And they're really now tying it to TBI, which I think is a more accurate statement,
Hmm.
personally. But one of the things that you also mentioned that I like to talk about because one of my other specialties is grief. And you
Hmm.
talked about the grief, and people always think, oh, it's a loss of a person. I'm like, no, grief's a lot bigger than that. And
Hmm.
for you, you talked about the grief and how difficult it is to
Yeah.
kind of like, whether it's losing vocabulary, losing some abilities. Some people lose, parts of using their limbs, right? We're going to extremes here, but
Right.
that does occur. Do you talk about that when you do therapy with other people, in particular grief?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, grief comes up in a lot of different dynamics, not just TBI. I mean, it comes up in just, somebody just lost somebody that's near and dear to them or something that's very important, but then also trauma and how that impacts identity, especially identity formation on who could I have been if this didn't impact my development, or, even like infidelity, right? There's grief and loss in that, right? When you put that trust in somebody and it's betrayed, so that betrayal trauma. But yeah, I mean, the grief and loss, for people can be very, very difficult even to notice at certain points, or it may not come for a year or two after you're able to self-reflect, right?
Right.
So for me, one of the big shifts for me was I went from being very active physically to having to pause that, right? Because I couldn't put pressure on my head, even blood pressure, right?
Right.
So, not being able to work out for a few months was very difficult and very restless for me. Or, being 17, it's all about like young adulthood, being able to have freedom and driving, right? But they took my license. So
Right.
now I'm kind of stuck, right?
No, no grief there whatsoever. A 17-year-old
Right.
kid, right?
Yeah. So, your friends are talking about bonfires and stuff on the weekends, but you're not able to go, right? One, because maybe you can't drive, but two, because you're also one of the other hallmarks of TBIs is fatigue. And I was in bed by 7 o'clock, and usually bonfires in the summer don't start at 7 o'clock. So
Correct. I
there,
mean,
there's
unless you're in the Antarctic, but that's a different
right.
story for a different day.
Yes. So those are some of those dynamics that show up, right? Of grief and loss later on.
I think that grief is everywhere. When you transition out of college, you transfer to college, you go to a different job. I'm working with several people now who are in the retirement transition, and there's a lot of grief and loss that goes from that. So yeah, I just wanted to put it out there because I like having my guests talk about grief because I'm done hearing, oh, it's only when you lose someone. I'm like, I wish it was just that. It'd be
Yeah.
so much easier.
Oh, yeah.
Um,
There's so much more to that.
so I mentioned the military earlier, and that the reason why I mentioned that is because I know you work with a lot of military personnel,
Mhm.
current and former. Can you tell us more about that work?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously protecting, dynamic certain pieces of information, but usually that work revolves around some sort of stress or stressor or trauma, either, reintegrating into the society, or something that happened, years ago that hasn't been dealt with. And, you know, I think there's still this very big adage of like, or belief that if we say we need help, we're less than or weak in some way. And we often forget that it takes a lot of courage just to come to that conclusion in and of ourselves, but then to reach out and ask for somebody. But I think, yeah, a lot of it kind of on that same note is like we don't have to live just like with these chains dragging behind us, and
Right.
we're missing out on a lot of different things when we are being held back. But yeah, first responders, military could be very, how do I want to say it? Something very very recently that happened, or something that happened years ago, right? Like you're trained in EMDR, so there are different EMDR protocols to utilize, right? There's the full protocol for things that are less than, more than 6 months, and then you can go like eye movement and desensitization, or EMD, and become very laser pointed on certain things that recently happened. So yeah, you don't have to just like bear it for a year or two. It could be like, this happened last month. Like, you got to
Right.
take the charge off of it. So,
Well, it's I was doing a CIT training, which is crisis intervention team with police, and for police do that
hmm
now. And one of the things I explained, not only for the people in the community, I said, even for you guys in the first responder world, something happens and it kind of bothers you. You don't want to say it in front of the guys and the gals you work with. That's fine. That's okay. I don't have a
yeah,
problem with that. But address it immediately, because
right.
that becomes, instead of having that's an acute stress disorder, and you can address that fairly quickly. You got about EMD, and there's also some it's called EMDR 2.0, and a Dutch
hmm
person came up with that. It's like six
hmm
weeks and it's super quick. But I
hmm
explained to them that for you don't want things to become post-traumatic stress disorder, because those
Yeah,
can accumulate. So if you're able to
right.
address it in the front as an acute stress disorder, it makes things so much easier.
Yeah, on yourself and those around you, right?
Right.
Because then it doesn't fester and impact interpersonal relationships, finances, work relationships, and or work productivity, right?
Right.
Because oftentimes, like if you're involved in those types of situations that created it in the first place, the likelihood of it happening again in the future is also there. And then you have like this compounded effect if you're also not addressing them as they roll in, right?
Right.
And then looking at disconnection from emotions, dissociation, disconnection with children, if you have children in the house, like all these different things, challenges with sleep. So yeah, it's better just to take care of it if you can. But yeah, I mean, if you don't feel comfortable talking about it with people, because there is kind of that stigma. And I also think there's one of the pieces that I also talk about too is how, like, I don't know about your practice, but I'm only private pay. So like
Okay.
I don't I don't have to manage the diagnosis piece, because that then enters your medical chart, right? And that can come back to influence certain things later down the line, maybe life insurance, approval, or purchasing life insurance if there's ever like unemployment and you have to buy insurance in the marketplace, right? So all those different pieces kind of
Right.
come into play, right?
It does definitely come up. And, the other part too that, you talked about PTSD and private pay. I actually take insurance just because of where I'm at in this area in Massachusetts. I highly likely could go self pay, but I know that would deter at least half of my first responders, if not more.
hmm
And for me,
hmm
as I joke around, and people have heard me on the podcast, so I always say, like, working with first responders or currently in the community. I don't know about you, but I want my first responders to be very stable in the community, because I live in the community.
hmm
I want to be stable for me and for them.
Right.
And so that's why, like, I talk about the treatment being so important, especially, EMDR PTSD. And I can't remember the exact stat. You can look it up if you wish. And if you say, Steve, you were wrong, just drop me a DM, and that's fine with me. But I think the stat is something like regular people will see 5 to 10 traumatic events in their lifetime. First responders, particularly law enforcement, is more close to 800.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not familiar with that stat. I think one of the recent blog posts I wrote like last month, it was around like 80% of first responders. So EMTs, firefighters, not just police,
Right.
80% will have experienced a traumatic event in at one time in their work career, with that number then escalating depending on certain professions and stuff like that. So it's very prevalent, right?
Right.
And they can, even if they're like the little T traumas, or even if it
Haven't heard
doesn't,
that in a while there, Bessel.
yeah, right, right, it's like the little T traumas that, maybe there is no loss of life in a car accident that you come up on, but it still looks pretty horrific, right? Like those things build and they leave their marks in the nervous system. And I love how EMDR, and I'm also are you familiar with somatic experiencing
I am, but
therapy?
maybe my audience isn't.
So yeah, so that was developed by Peter Levine. It's a EMDR is a bottom-up form of therapy. Somatic experiencing is a form of bottom-up therapy, or instead of top-down, meaning like Steve mentioned, ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, and that's more of a top-down therapy. But really, what I'm trying to explain is that when we experience those levels of stress, overwhelm, or fear for our safety or other people's safety, they can leave those marks on our nervous system. And those marks can then just kind of fester and then create symptoms of, more reactivity versus responsiveness, right? More impulsivity, or maybe more worry, more hypervigilance, right? So you're not meeting that PTSD threshold, but there's some sort of nervous system dysregulation going on that EMDR and somatic experiencing can help realign and re-regulate those systems.
And mentioned I know his name's Daniel. I didn't. He's not really Bessel van der Kolk, but that's the anyone who's interested. The body keeps the score. I find
Hmm.
that for people in our field, it's pretty cool. I've had a hit or miss with the community reading it. They say this is boring as hell because it can be intensive. But
Yeah.
other people have said, no, this changed my life. And Peter Levine is someone I met at a couple of conferences.
Nice.
Truly, truly love that man. And I think that what you talk, like I want to make sure that people knew about that because it's such an important part of how we treat now because he really gets, for lack of a better word, you talk about top down versus bottom up.
Bottom. Hmm.
I call it intervention so it doesn't affect you in the long term.
Hmm.
And Peter is brilliant, brilliant, brilliant human being for that. I
Hmm.
highly recommend his stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think like that, the Peter does a really amazing job of also describing and teaching that, like, for first responders and or military. I know we've been kind of talking about those populations, so I'll keep it kind of honed in there. But it's also like not so much just like, were you in a life-threatening situation, right? It could be like you were on a ladder trying to help somebody get out of a burning building and you fell or slipped and almost fell, right?
Right.
Or, one somebody I know from high school was in the military, and, it was like maybe 2011, 2012, 2013, and an explosion went off right above their outpost and he fell down and had a concussion, right? So like those components, it's not like were you shot at, yes or no, right? It was like, did something happen that where you feared consciously or unconsciously for your well-being. And Peter has this one video too that he that's shown in the trainings of like a surfer feeling that something was wrong and noticing a dorsal fin was following him as he was paddling, right?
Right.
And like that is, threat to self, or from a predator, right? An apex predator. And those can even leave those nervous system dysregulation pieces in.
Yeah. And the example I also give for community members is I had a client who works with electricity and felt his
Mm,
hair get really, really like, well, I don't have any, so just pretend here. When he got too close to a high voltage situation. And it freaked him out for several months because he's like, I almost died. And I'm like, you didn't die, and regrounding and getting in front of it
mm.
versus let's wait till till it's trauma and address it. But that affects you and affects your day to day. Thankfully, he was able to get back to his job, do everything that he's supposed to. But yeah, I think that that's why like techniques like Peter's are better to get there versus EMDR. Not that EMDR is not good and sufficient. It's just different
Yeah.
levels.
Yeah. And I think they both play their place. And I think when you get to also a level as a clinician, you just kind of interweave them in, and there's a lot of beauty.
Yeah, and I think that that's what it is. People who work with trauma or acute stress, and particularly military personnel, we talked about first responders. Let's not forget our dispatchers, and
Hmm.
particularly in the military personnel, the Coast Guard people, who are
Hmm.
the first responders of the military personnel. Not there that there isn't in other branches. I'm just saying that they're
Sure.
primarily their job.
Hmm. definitely.
They also go through some of that stuff, and it's very important to kind of like put them out there because
Yeah.
dispatch
And
gets forget too often.
yep, and also frontline nursing staff.
Correct. I think
The-
that's why I keep it like I run a group for first responders, and it is for all those individuals because you
Mhm.
can't limit it. I think that most people think about firefighters and police when we say first responders. They're
Mhm.
so much bigger and it can affect you, like dispatch being in a call. Suddenly you
Yeah.
hear like a shot or you hear something and then it hangs up and you don't know what's going on for 5 minutes, yet you got to take the
Right.
next call that's coming through. That kind
Yeah.
of can be traumatic for most people.
Oh yeah, or you have to be on those calls where people can't talk too loud or they're talking almost in code because of certain dynamics in their residence or where they're at. And you just kind of have to be there in this. It's a very strange position to be like wanting to do something and wanting to act quickly, but like also keeping that governor on and you're just kind of stuck.
It
Yeah,
is.
Peter Levine's trainings, they talk a lot about like inescapable attack, like when you can't fight, but you know you want to, but you can't because A, it won't work out well and it's kind of yeah,
I'm going to charge Peter for all this advertisement we're giving him.
perfect. No.
Um,
He's a wonderful training too for therapists that are listening for the somatic experiencing and nervous system regulation. It's incredible.
he's just an amazing guy. Um,
Hmm.
you talked about acceptance and commitment therapy a little earlier on. You know, you ran it really quickly, and we talked about other stuff. But I want to get back to it because one of the things is I know a lot of people. When I read the book on ACT, I'm like, I already did this. I'm like, oh, I
Hmm.
guess there is a name for it. But I guess I want you to explain a little more what ACT or acceptance and commitment therapy looks, what how you
For,
use it also in your practice.
for sure. So ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy's main goal is to increase somebody's psychological flexibility. And that means kind of just riding with the stress of life, not getting caught up by too many different things, but also being able to let go of certain things. And, that can, taking that a step further, that could be like, oh, like maybe somebody had a really poor or like was shocked by like a work performance review, but then that goes on for the next, 2, 3 months and it disrupts their functioning or their life and how they work versus like ACT would kind of target some of those pieces and try to get that psychological flexibility. Maybe there's just some dysregulation or something for like a week or two, right? But then it kind of rolls off the back. But ACT is underpinned by it's called the hexaflex, but people can Google it, right? But it essentially is diffusion. Oh, I haven't thought about this in a minute. Diffusion, values, present moment focus, and then I'm blanking on a couple right now. I
I know
feel
I'm blanking too.
yeah.
I haven't heard that word in a long time,
I
so I
know.
apologize.
I can pull it up quick.
Well,
Uh,
I'll put it in the show notes when I do find it,
Perfect.
because I'm blanking. You already got me in the third one. I'm like, oh crap, he took the
Yeah.
one I knew.
Self as context, acceptance, and committed action.
Committed
So
action.
present moment focus, values, committed action, self as context, diffusion, and then acceptance. And essentially they call it a hexaflex because your interventions can bounce back and forth in diffusion. So fusion meaning something is very close together. Think of like welding, right? Very tight. Diffusion is creating space. So space meaning like you have a negative thought, and then it leads to like a poor mood response, right? Or like maybe you're feeling sad. So diffusion would try to create some space so that thought doesn't influence the mood dynamic like that directly. And then self as context is like, how do we see ourselves in relation to who we are? How do other people see us? And then values, committed action, acceptance, and then all the whole game of working around through those types of interventions is to increase psychological flexibility. So,
And I think that you don't need to go through a traumatic response, whether in the military or the first responder world, in
yeah.
order to bring that home sometimes.
Hmm.
Most people, one of my hopefully people listening to this podcast and people who know my work, I want to break the thing about, oh, all first responders is trauma. Nope.
Hmm.
Sometimes it's not trauma. It's other stuff that happens. You bring it home because of XYZ reason. And the
Hmm.
vicarious trauma that can come from hearing like really bad stories from other people. And for the record, while for therapists are not first responders, I encourage them strongly to think about their vicarious trauma regularly
Oh,
in
yes.
order to unload it.
Yeah. I mean, and and just to piggyback on that, I mean, therapists are one level of, you know, the helping profession, but also the people who are therapists in hospital settings, departments of corrections. Like you really see a lot, or inpatient psychiatric hospitals, right? Or community-based mental health services, doing in-home visits. Like those are, yeah, I mean, seeking your own therapy for being in the helping profession is also very, very much okay.
Right. And, you know, on the government level, the child and family services and
Hmm.
youth services, or whatever they call it
Yeah.
in your state
Yeah.
or province, or, you know, whatever
Yeah.
county, they also see a whole lot of different things. And it's important to think about that.
Hmm.
But I appreciate you explaining a little more. And thank you for also catching me on Hexaplex.
Yeah.
Because I
No
was
worries.
like, oh crap,
I
he
know.
caught.
I was like,
So, and just for the record, a good thing for you if you're listening, Daniel and I just proved one thing. While we are versed in what we do, we are by far not perfect and we still forget shit.
yeah. And that's a part about being human, right? Like nobody's perfect. I mean, we can't always be 100% on and have all the information at our fingertips. So that's why
Well,
there's Google.
right. And ultimately, that's why I tell people too when they come in and they talk to me, don't ever ask me how I feel unless you want to know the answer. So
Hmm.
I'm always truthful. And people are like, well, why are you sharing your story with people? I said, so they can share theirs and feel comfortable that
Hmm.
they can do the same thing.
You're right.
And I think that that's the other part about being human as a therapist is I share those stories. I share a lot of this stuff because sometimes I'll be like, oh yeah, EMDR. And you know, if you do the six, oh, what is it? Oh, crap. I got to look it up. Give me a second.
Hmm.
And I look it up and people are like, oh, so you don't know everything. I'm like, no, I don't even know the diagnostic criteria exactly for PTSD. And I've worked with PTSD for 20 years. I still
Hmm.
once in a while go, oh, what's the other one? And that's just how it is.
Yeah. It also doesn't help that it changes every like 4 or 5 years too. So that's,
Well, well, wait till the debate starts about complex PTSD.
I
That'll
know,
be a
right?
very interesting one. Or
Yeah.
CPTSD for those who want to know
Yes.
the initials.
Hmm.
Uh,
Definitely. And kind of taking what you're saying a step further, like the therapeutic dynamic is part of the healing process, the relational process, the attachment process, even outside of if you're doing ACT, EMDR, somatic experiencing, cognitive processing therapy, like the just the relational aspect is a significant portion of the healing process to be able to be vulnerable and to be accepted and to receive not I don't want to say feedback, but to receive just insight and support for what you're experiencing versus invalidation
right.
is a significant portion of the healing process. And that is, one thing that comes to my mind, and it came when you were explaining that, was my work with a previous supervisor. And it was kind of like we were doing a supervision session, and this is kind of off topic and tangential, but I think it applies to like the helping profession and like first responders and military. Is like a lot of people are familiar with Helen Keller
Hmm.
and like know that story, or at least the framework of the story, right? But
Right.
not many people remember her instructor's name. And
Hmm.
her instructor was the one who ignited this whole thing, right?
Right.
And like that's how like I think about like people in the helping profession and like our roles, and then also like you never know who you're gonna save or protect, right? And what they're gonna go on to do.
Absolutely.
Right.
And by the way, it's not a tangent. It's absolutely related because
Okay.
I'll go to the theory behind this. And Gabor Mate, if you are familiar with him, if you're not,
Mhm.
that's fine. Gabor Mate talks about how in a therapeutic relationship, your words are not as important as the electrical connection between your two brains and your two hearts, because
Yeah.
that's what makes the therapeutic relationship. The sympathy,
Mhm.
the empathy, the actual connection with another human being who shows compassion for what you've been through is
Right.
significantly more important than, oh, did you use ACT, CBT, EMD, or whatever technique, the
Right.
alphabet soup of treatment, as I call it.
Right.
It really is that connection, and that's why like it's not tangential. I think it's very accurate for people who want to find themselves through therapy. You got
Yeah.
to learn how to be like sometimes just be connected. Some as I said, some days I'm going to talk about a specific trauma with someone, and then
Mm-hmm.
some days we're going to talk about a hockey game, a football game, or something like that for 30 minutes. And people are like, oh, that's not therapeutic. I'm like, are you connected with me? Yeah, I actually enjoyed having that conversation with you. So that's therapy.
Yeah.
And reminding a lot of the therapists that the importance is really the connection, not just
Mm-hmm.
going, okay, what's the goal? What's I know the insurances won't like what I say, but the truth is that I don't work on goals all the time. I really work on what's in the here and now. And sometimes people are
Yeah.
like tired, they don't want to talk about stuff, and that's fine too. Or people are
Yeah.
like, oh, I'm in a good mood. And I'm like, I always joke around. People are like, I'm in a good mood. You can ask me anything. I say, you be careful what you ask for.
Yeah, and you talk about like the minds being connected and the hearts being connected in the therapy session, and in like Peter Levine, EMDR, or somatic experiencing in an EMDR, like we get into like that co-regulation with the nervous system, right? Like I can be an anchor for you, you can be an anchor for me if it's needed, right? And that goes back and forth in the therapeutic dynamic and
Absolutely.
having that alignment, right?
Well, and I think that that's, especially you said, you talked about the therapeutic relationship with first responders and military. Both of us are not military or first responders, and we never want to share. And like, I don't, I'm sure you're the same way. And if you can correct me if I'm wrong, we don't want to take those roles. We don't want that, but we have experience with that. And sometimes we
Hmm.
got to kind of like share those experiences in order for credibility. And it sucks, but that's
Right.
how sometimes works.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, I mean, I think the credibility, but also the part that, as therapists, we experience our own stuff too,
Right.
right? I mean, hence I shared my a little bit about my TBI recovery, right? Like, I mean, like we're not immune to the challenges of life in any way, shape, or form. And oftentimes it's some of those pieces that are driving forces behind why we entered the profession, right? So,
Well, you talk about your TBI being in the profession. If you ever listen to my podcast, and for my audience, they probably heard me say it too many times, but I lost my best friend when I was 12.
mhm.
And I didn't have time for grief process or anything else. I was just alone with all those thoughts for several years. And for
Yeah,
me, my motivation in therapy is like never someone being alone with that, just
yeah.
having that outlet. So, but speaking of family, friends, and all that, holidays right now,
Mhm.
middle of December, people are going to go the home to home and maybe also have some differences, whether it is a family long-term issue, something as current as the political system, or even
Hmm.
some hurt based on, maybe traumas or things that have happened in the past. Do you have any suggestion on how to handle that stress for the holidays?
Yeah, I'll send over a blog post I recently wrote for how to manage some of those things and going into it. But I think prepping, right? We are usually creatures of habit on some way, shape, or form. So I'm guessing that these issues have maybe probably been around in one way or another throughout somebody's life. So knowing that, hey, these may show up at some point. So mentally preparing, also having, kind of like if you're going with family members, like from your immediate, family unit, and having maybe like an escape word or something to leave the room, right? Setting boundaries that, if they ask about, oh, who'd you vote for? Or, why'd you vote for them? And being like, I don't really think that this is the place to discuss that. Let's just enjoy our time together. And if they continue to press, you have the right to walk away too. You don't have to sit and take that. And then also building up, so like for Steve and I, like building up some of those internal resources, but essentially building up some of those ways that help you tolerate discomfort. So that could mean like sometimes people have like fidget things in their pockets or like stress balls, finding ways to maybe take a break. So go to the bathroom,
Right,
reset, go for a walk, all those different pieces. Or maybe the kids are playing in a different room and you go supervise them, right? Just to remove yourself. We can't always control other people, but we can control our own responsiveness
right.
and to not react, right? Because once we start getting into more of the reaction mindset, then we're more in like sympathetic nervous system dysregulation, like fight or flight. So just being responsive and just saying, you know what, I'm going to go do something else. Not letting ego get in the way. Sometimes we want to be the correct one, And we may we may believe we are, and we may be right, but
What do you
we're also
mean,
not going to
may?
change.
I'm always right, man.
Yeah. So that's what I say too. No. But we also can't impose that on other people. So
Well, I'm gonna address something you said too, because I like to tell people TV is your best friend because unless it's on blank news, choose your news outlet. If it's, a Christmas movie or a holiday movie, as I should say, as a politically correct human being, and I am, or watching sports, whatever it's like basketball, football, hockey, there's a lot of sports on right now.
hmm
It's a great equalizer because people like when they're watching the game, watching a movie, they want to talk about the movie or the game or when's the first time you saw a Christmas story, for example, or whatever.
hmm
And that's a great equalizer. And it also changes the subject and keeps you safe. So I want to add that as another trick.
Definitely. Definitely.
So,
For sure.
the other part too that I thought was funny is you like, take your time and walk away or have something like a fidget. Here's my
Yeah.
fidget for those who go on YouTube. I'm not going to tell you what it is because there's someone who mentioned in my direct messages, stop playing with your beard
Mm.
on YouTube. But for me, it's kind of a management of like calm
hmm
yourself, pace yourself. So again, I just did it. I didn't do it to piss off anyone, I promise. I'm just saying that, sometimes we also have other things that we can use. And for me, my beard is a great way. Women use their hair sometimes. It's a way to self-soothe.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely finding, and that kind of goes back to those internal resources that we can create is like we are trying to self-soothe our nervous system, right? So finding those things, sometimes it's a certain meal at a holiday party, right? Or certain scents can be very powerful. Or like scenery. So like thinking like if there's like a fireplace or something like that, like all those pieces are ways and you have to find what works best for you, but like we have the ability to self-soothe, right? And that's what's really, really beautiful is to start uncovering those if you haven't. But when we grow up in, childhood trauma or, you know, family dynamics that are very stressful, we may not be shown and or given the time to explore those. So then those are on you to figure out now as you grow, right?
Right.
Nobody's going to figure them out for you.
No one said it'd be easy,
You're right.
so I think that that's all good advice for the holidays. And I do appreciate you coming to the podcast. I know you wanted to share your blog, and I'm certainly going to put it in the show notes. So
Yeah,
that's not a big deal. What else are you working on? What are you doing? How can people reach you? Stuff like that.
for sure. So I am the founder therapist of Revitalized Mental Health PLC. So we're located in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and then I am licensed in throughout Wisconsin as well as in Colorado. But really focusing in on helping men heal. It could be from trauma, grief, loss, just the stress of life that is often not discussed, especially among men. First responders, military, so those pieces. But I'm certified in EMDR and then almost done with somatic experiencing with Peter Levine, and
Okay.
then also trained in CPT as well, cognitive processing therapy.
You're
So,
trained in CPT.
mhm.
Oh my God, that's like amazing. You want to talk about it? I know we're plugging here, so to speak.
Yeah.
Just say it
So,
quickly.
so cognitive behavioral therapy, cognitive processing therapy is a derivative of CBT, but it's more tailored towards trauma, looking at just kind of the different types of thoughts, beliefs, and then or thoughts, intermediate thoughts, and then beliefs, and then really getting into core beliefs and stuff like that. But really working to rewire some of the brain or the neural networks that were shifted during trauma. I've seen it be, just from my own clinical experience, I've seen it be really helpful for like single incident traumas. But when you get more into like the complex pieces like EMDR and somatic experiencing seem to fit a little bit better. At least that's my clinical opinion. I don't know what the research says on, is CBT, but that's my experience. And I'll own that. But
No,
yeah, CBT is it's, anywhere from 12 to 16 sessions long. It's very, very manualized form of therapy, heavily used by like the VA, the federal governments, just like EMDR is. So,
if you're a therapist interested in that and you have not learned from it in the military, it is expensive for us civilians.
Hmm.
but it's well worthwhile. I am not trained yet. It is one of the trainings I'm looking into. And I have a few colleagues who are military who've learned CPT who says that it's been a game changer in their treatment.
Yeah. Yeah, it is a nice piece. There is homework in it though.
Well,
That
yeah,
is,
that's why I think one of them said, if it wasn't for homework, I would love this treatment.
yeah.
And I'm like, well, if it wasn't for homework, you wouldn't be really moving forward. But anyway,
Right, right. So you have to, as a therapist, it's important to match not only what's going to be beneficial clinically, but also like what does the person have capacity to do in their life, right? Sometimes people are working, 2 dead-end jobs just to put food on the table and to spend 40 minutes a week doing like clinically oriented writing or typing may not always be beneficial.
no, and I think that sometimes being raw and writing your like journaling or writing the homework is a lot more significant than saying, do you know what ACT
Mhm.
stands for? Or exaplex and all that. Like we don't even know it. We're therapists. And
Right.
it's good to work on stuff that is more down to earth. And that's how I explain it.
Yep, definitely.
Well,
Definitely.
as we approach the about almost an hour already,
Yeah.
I want to thank you. This was absolutely beneficial. Looking forward to possibly talking again because I think that, especially talking about Peter, like I said, Peter probably owes us a few dollars here. I'm joking, Peter. If you're listening, I'm just joking. I don't think he listens to my podcast, but anyway.
You never
Um,
know.
but I think that there's a lot to be said, and because as I've going to mention very soon in my podcast in the next few weeks, I'm really concentrating working on the first responder world and working with trauma and grief in the future. And my podcast is going to probably shift to more of that subject matter.
Oh,
Love to have you back on at some point if you
yeah,
want to.
for sure. Would
I want
love to be back on and share a little bit more in like clinical stuff around somatic experiencing and just have a genuine conversation too about what have we noticed works well, what doesn't work well. You know, it's just a fascinating realm to support people in healing and what will work for 16 people might not work for the next 35. Like, so we're not robots. And I think that's the hard part with, some of the dynamics, the bureaucracy within the therapeutic realm with billing and stuff like that is time treatment and stuff like that. But
I'll leave you on my political statement of the day. When you go for cancer treatment, there's over 25 different treatments you can have, not even counting the experimental stuff. And we
mhm.
accept that readily with no exceptions, and that's fine. For diabetes, there's at least 7 to 8 medication before you even start doing insulin directly. And we
Mhm.
accept that. In mental health, you got to have one technique that works for everyone. I mean, come on, wake up, people.
Right, right.
Sorry.
Yeah.
That's my
So
political
it's
statement for today.
Yeah, and I think I'm hoping in the next few years we will also move forward in terms of a lot of research related to EMDR, somatic experiencing, and any new forms of therapy that may be just kind of on that cutting edge cusp that we don't always hear about because it's not empirically supported right away.
Right. Well,
So
and evidence-based treatment is such a catchword nowadays. And I see some value in that, but sometimes I
mhm,
think that, what works may not be evidence-based stuff.
yeah.
Again, a
Mhm.
little political statement. I can't wait for the APA to pick up on this. But I want to wish you happy holidays to you.
Yeah, you too. Thank you.
Enjoy it. I hope people go to your blog and go read it and really
Yeah,
great advice there. So thank you for that.
awesome. And I'll send you my links and everything for to put in the notes.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Awesome. Take care, okay?
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Daniel. And I'm not pronouncing your last name because I'm going to screw it up again for being here. And I hope people got a lot of stuff from that. I'll put it in the show notes, all his links. But on episode 182, I'm going to have Dave Roberts on, and Dave will be an interesting guest. Also met him through Facebook. So I hope you join me then.
Please like, subscribe, and follow this podcast on your favorite platform. A glowing review is always helpful. And as a reminder, this podcast is for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only. If you're struggling with a mental health or substance abuse issue, please reach out to a professional counselor for consultation. If you are in a mental health crisis, call 988 for assistance. This number is available in the United States and Canada.